Welcome to Surreal Crimes. In today's episode, I'll be telling you about events that took place in 2017 in the quiet neighborhood of Southfields in southwest London. The disturbing reason behind this case will leave you shocked and confused. Let's delve into the story of Sophie Lean, Sabrina and Sam Muduni. Sophie Lean was born on the 7th of January 1996 to parents Catherine and Patrick Lean in the town of Troyes in northeast France. At some point, Catherine and Patrick divorced, and Catherine remarried a man named Stephen who became Sophie's stepfather, but Sophie remained close with both of her parents. She was described as a beautiful, quiet and gentle girl with a warm smile. She loved playing the guitar, reading, ice skating, and she had a deep love for animals. She hated suffering and was passionate about preventing animal cruelty. Sophie was a selfless and generous person, and it was her dream to work with children. When she finished school, she completed a vocational course in childcare, and shortly after that, she was offered a position as an au pair in London. This was the perfect opportunity for her because she wanted to improve her English, and working with children had always been her dream. But the story really begins with Sabrina, who was born in 1983 in Algeria. Her family moved to Paris when she was young, and it was there, at the age of 18, that she met a man named Sam Muduni at a fun fair. He was 5 years older than her, and he was also French-Algerian. The two began dating since then. In 2005, when Sabrina was 22 and Sam was 27, they left France and moved to London, where Sabrina worked as an au pair, makeup artist, and later at a French bank. She then went on to become quite successful, working as a stylist, fashion designer, and songwriter. Sabrina was described as a glamorous woman who was soft-spoken, but she had another side to her personality, one that would become increasingly apparent as events unfolded. Her relationship with Sam was very on and off, and in 2011 they were separated. That same year, when Sabrina was standing in line at a bank in Notting Hill. Behind her in the line was Mark Walton, one of the founding members of the boy band Boyzone. By 2011, he was managing a band called Blue and had worked with major artists like Lady Gaga, Enrique Iglesias, and Jennifer Lopez. The bank manager, noticing their mutual interest in each other, facilitated an introduction. Sabrina messaged Mark, inviting him to what he thought was a date at a bar. However, when he arrived, there were 11 other men already there. Sabrina had invited these 12 men not on dates, but as part of a recruiting scheme for a phone line pyramid scam. Most of the men left, but Mark stayed, intrigued by her, and actually invested in the scheme, despite the fact that it cost him far more than he was told it would. They began talking on the phone daily and meeting every night. Sabrina opened up to Mark, telling him she had been abused her entire life and had even been raped by 2 of her uncles. Mark's protective instincts were aroused, and he wanted to take care of her. Meanwhile, Sabrina was attracted to Mark's wealth and famous connections. After 5 months, Mark moved out of his Notting Hill apartment and into Sabrina's place in Queensway, paying her £2,000 a month in rent. Soon after moving in together, Mark began to see Sabrina's darker side. She was prone to violent outbursts, once waking him by punching him in the face so hard it left a bruise, simply because he was snoring. On another occasion, she threw an ashtray at his head during an argument. Sabrina was also extremely jealous. She already had a child from a previous relationship, and after Mark moved in, they went through 4 full-time nannies because Sabrina accused him of cheating with every single one. She installed cameras throughout their apartment to monitor him and the nannies, despite there being no evidence of any inappropriate behavior. Mark later said he knew there were problems with her lying and violent outbursts, but he believed she was damaged from her past experiences and he wanted to look after her. However, everything she had told him about her traumatic past turned out to be lies. After 14 months together, Sabrina became pregnant, and Mark was excited about becoming a father. But a few months later, she claimed she needed to go to France because her mother was ill. A couple of weeks later, she called Mark and coldly told him the baby was dead, that she'd had a miscarriage, and he should move on with his life. Mark was devastated, but when he spoke to Sabrina's brother, he discovered that Sabrina had been lying. She hadn't had a miscarriage and had actually given birth to the baby. Despite this betrayal, Mark stayed with her. Eventually, In August 2013, Mark put down a £4,000 deposit on a flat in Southfields for Sabrina and paid the first 5 to 6 months of rent to support her and their baby. He then moved to Los Angeles for work, and that's when Sabrina completely cut contact with him. Mark responded by cutting her off financially, unsure if the baby was actually his. In a fit of rage, Sabrina called all of his biggest clients, including major celebrities, and told them he was a pedophile. She filed 30 police reports against him, claiming he was part of a black magic pedophile ring. She even claimed he was sexually abusing her cat, despite never owning a cat. Unable to get her hands on Mark, who was now in Los Angeles, Sabrina began taking her frustrations out on those around her. She became well known in the Southfields neighborhood for her violent outbursts. The area was a quiet, well-to-do community where residents noticed everything and gossip spread quickly. The owner of the local newsagent, Sunny Patel, experienced her behavior firsthand when she forgot her wallet while shopping and, instead of apologizing, began screaming at him and called the police on him. The police came and had to escort her out, recognizing that she was in the wrong. Neighbors knew her as antisocial and odd. She wasn't just difficult due to her violent outbursts, she was also generally annoying to live near. She left garbage on the street, blocked people's driveways with her car, and didn't pay her rent on time. After Mark left for Los Angeles and cut off financial support, Sabrina got back together with Sam Muduni. In 2016, he moved in with her in the Southfields flat. Sam had earned a degree in economics and worked as a financial analyst, making enough money to buy 2 rental properties in France. He was able to provide for himself and Sabrina. Sam helped raise her 2 children, both from previous relationships, and practically worshipped the ground Sabrina walked on. He was very submissive toward her, even when he discovered she was cheating on him multiple times. She would leave him for other men, just as she had done with Mark, but she always came back to Sam, and he always took her back without question. Even after they'd gotten back together following Mark's departure, Sabrina was clearly not over Mark. She talked about him constantly and even took his photo to local shops, telling people they needed to call the police if they saw him because he was breaking into her house to abuse her children and steal Sam's semen. This was what she was telling people while Mark was living on the other side of the world in Los Angeles. In 2017, Sabrina and Sam decided to hire an au pair. They hired 21-year-old Sophie Lean. An au pair is typically a young person, usually between 18 and 30 and often from another country, who lives with a host family and helps with childcare and light housework. In exchange, the family provides accommodation, meals, and a modest amount of pocket money. However, au pairs are not classified as employees or workers. This means they aren't entitled to a salary, minimum wage, or paid leave. In the UK, there are no formal regulations governing their working conditions or pay, leaving many au pairs vulnerable to mistreatment and exploitation. In January 2017, she moved to London to work for Sabrina and Sam, stepping into a role that, while meant to be cultural and supportive, came with few protections. They paid her just £63 a month. At first, everything seemed fine. Sabrina and Sam appeared to be loving parents, and Sophie got along wonderfully with the children, who adored her in return. Neighbors described Sophie as very shy and humble, a beautiful person who was always pleasant and polite. One neighbor said she was so good with the children and had a lovely face. She was kind and quite shy, and she even set up a mini shop on the street with the children, selling sweets and biscuits. When she called her mother, she seemed genuinely happy. She said she got along great with Sabrina, and they would often chat over tea. Sabrina, who had worked as a makeup artist, even gave Sophie a makeover. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before things started to deteriorate. Sabrina became increasingly demanding, forcing Sophie to work 80 hours a week for her measly £63 monthly wage. Residents of Southfields began to notice that they hardly ever saw Sabrina with the children anymore. Sophie was the one dropping them off, picking them up, doing all the grocery shopping, essentially everything. Sunny Patel, the newsagent owner, said Sophie would come into his shop twice a day to buy groceries and sweets for the children. She would also buy cigarettes, which surprised him at first because he thought she was only 13 years old, even though she was 21. As time passed, residents began to notice that Sophie was becoming extremely thin and unkempt. They assumed she was perhaps struggling to adjust to life with the children and was feeling overwhelmed. Michael Cromer, who owned the local fish and chip shop, was one of those who noticed Sophie seemed to be struggling. When he asked if everything was okay, she told him her mother back in France wasn't doing well. Concerned, he began giving Sophie free chips and soft drinks. When Sabrina discovered this kindness, she stormed into the fish and chip shop, screamed at both Michael and Sophie, and dragged Sophie out. Michael was so shocked by this behavior that the next time he saw Sophie, he offered to pay for her flight back to France. Sophie declined, likely terrified of what Sabrina would do if she found out. What Michael and the other neighbors didn't know was that behind closed doors, Sophie was being abused by Sabrina and Sam. Even more incredibly, Sabrina had begun accusing Sophie of having an affair with her ex-boyfriend Mark Walton, who lived in Los Angeles. Sophie had never heard of Mark Walton, and he had never heard of her. They had never even lived in the UK at the same time, as Mark had moved to Los Angeles 3 years before Sophie was hired as an au pair. When Sophie denied everything, explaining she didn't even know who this man was, Sabrina refused to believe her. Sabrina began denying Sophie food, which explained why she was looking so thin. She constantly interrogated Sophie about Mark. She would scream cruel insults at Sophie, calling her a whore and a slut. Sophie didn't tell anyone about the abuse because she was scared of Sabrina and Sam. She was still learning English and was naturally shy and quiet, so she wasn't about to confide in people she didn't know well. Sophie didn't even tell her mother the full truth. She mentioned wanting to come home but said it was because she felt overwhelmed with the children. Her mother, having no idea what was really happening, convinced her not to give up. Eventually, Sophie did tell her mother she wanted to leave, though she didn't explain why. Her mother Catherine bought her a plane ticket home to France, but Sophie never received it because Sabrina destroyed it. Sabrina also took away Sophie's passport. Over the next 6 weeks, Sabrina's delusions only worsened. She began accusing Sophie of letting Mark into the house while everyone was asleep, claiming he would inject everyone with heroin so he could sexually abuse Sabrina's children while they were unconscious. As a result of these delusional accusations, Sabrina stopped paying Sophie entirely. Having already taken her passport, Sabrina now confiscated Sophie's phone as well. The only way Sophie could contact her parents was using Sabrina's phone while Sabrina stood right beside her, monitoring every word. Sabrina stopped allowing Sophie to leave the house except to pick up or drop off the children or go grocery shopping. She was treating Sophie like a slave, and eventually, she stopped letting her leave the house altogether. Up until this point, Sabrina had been solely responsible for the abuse and beatings. Whenever she started attacking Sophie, Sam would just walk away and clear his head. But now Sabrina recruited him into the torture, and he began carrying out the physical abuse himself. They would keep Sophie awake for days at a time. They would hold her down in the bathtub, place a cloth over her face, and slowly pour water over it, a cruel act meant to make her feel like she was drowning. It wasn't just physical torment, it was psychological warfare meant to break her completely. Most horrifically, they recorded some of this torture, documenting the last 12 days of Sophie's life in 18 recordings. There's a photograph that was released from one of these recordings showing Sophie looking almost unrecognizable, so thin and emaciated, clearly deteriorating. In these recordings, Sabrina and Sam can be heard yelling at Sophie, swearing at her, calling her names, trying to force a confession for all the Mark Walton allegations, which weren't even possible given that Mark lived on the other side of the world. The transcripts are heartbreaking because Sophie hardly ever responds. She was exhausted and worn down from experiencing this torture for 6 weeks. Throughout the transcripts, the translator noted things like, "You can hear Sophie crying here, you can hear the beating here." Sophie was terrified, while Sabrina and Sam were completely unhinged. At one point, Sabrina said, "I know you've brought him here, because I can smell it. You smell like sex when you come in the house." For most of these transcripts, throughout most of these recordings, Sabrina and Sam employ a classic good cop, bad cop routine. Sabrina takes the role of the hostile interrogator, screaming accusations and threats, while Sam positions himself as the understanding ally, softly coaxing with phrases like, "You can tell me, I can make this all stop if you just confess to me." This calculated psychological manipulation alternates between intimidation and false compassion, with Sam offering himself as Sophie's only path to relief from Sabrina's relentless aggression. What made it even more disturbing was that Sabrina and Sam seemed to genuinely believe their own accusations. They were completely convinced that Sophie was secretly involved with Mark and had been letting him into their home. Sophie had been deprived of food and sleep for days. They'd been waterboarding her and beating her for 6 weeks. She was exhausted and worn down. It appears they were suffering from folia dux, a psychological condition known as madness shared by two, in which delusional beliefs are transmitted from one person to another. Sabrina was having these delusions and passing them on to Sam, who shared in the delusions. The situation grew worse and worse as time went by. Sophie told Sabrina that she just wants to go back home to France. But instead, Sabrina told her, "If you try to leave, you will get arrested by the police, and you will go to jail for 40 years. After 6 weeks of torture, on the 18th of September 2017, the final recording was made. Sophie gave a false confession to Sabrina, worn down after being told repeatedly, "Just confess and you can go back to France." But after Sophie gave her false confession, Sabrina and Sam drowned her in the bathtub. They then proceeded to have sex on the floor of the bathroom next to Sophie's lifeless body. They then placed her partially clothed remains into a suitcase, concealing it within their home for nearly 2 days. Eventually, they attempted to dispose of her body by burning it in their garden. On the 20th of September, several neighbors contacted emergency services to report thick black smoke and rotting stench coming from the yard of Sam and Sabrina's flat. When the fire department arrived and knocked on the front door, Sam answered and claimed they were simply having a barbecue, cooking some chicken. The firefighters explained that even if that were the case, they needed to put out the fire because it was dangerously close to neighboring properties. When they went to the back garden, they did find a barbecue with chicken thighs on it, but the huge black fumes were coming from a bonfire burning out of control right next to it. After the firefighters put out the fire, they discovered what appeared to be human fingers and a human nose in the remains. When they questioned Sam, he claimed they had been cooking an entire lamb they'd gotten from the markets and had thrown it on the bonfire. The firefighters took a closer look and found human clothing and jewelry. They immediately contacted the police, and soon police cars lined the street, with the entire area cordoned off. Sophie's body was so badly burned, it took 2 weeks to identify her, and investigators were unable to determine the exact cause of death. The 3 most likely causes were a blow to the head, strangulation, or drowning. Sophie had experienced all 3, but it was unclear which finally killed her. They were able to determine that while she was alive, Sophie had sustained a fractured jaw, 5 fractured ribs, and a fractured sternum. Not only was the sternum fractured, but she had lived with this incredibly painful injury for up to 3 days. In Sophie's room, investigators found a note that read, "Why me? I need help to stop them." Sabrina Kuida and Sam Muduni were arrested for murder. At first, they tried to claim it was an accident. Sam initially attempted to take the blame, saying he and Sabrina were questioning Sophie about her relationship with Mark Walton, and when she wasn't cooperative, they put her head under water a few times. He claimed he got angry, punched her in the face, causing her to fall and hit her head and slip under the water where she drowned. He said he tried to revive her but failed. Later on, when Sam found out that Sabrina had begun accusing him of being solely responsible, Sam retracted that statement, saying he had been trying to protect Sabrina and that it was actually all her fault. He claimed he had been asleep when Sophie died, and when he woke up and found her unresponsive in the bathtub, he tried to revive her unsuccessfully. Sabrina blamed Sam and claimed she had no involvement whatsoever, which was ridiculous. Given that her phone contained those 18 recordings of the last 12 days of Sophie's life, in which she was clearly involved in beating and tormenting Sophie, both Sabrina and Sam were assessed by psychiatrists. Sabrina was diagnosed with depression and borderline personality disorder, but these conditions do not make someone violent or murderous. While she was mentally unwell at the time of the murders, she was not criminally insane. Sam wasn't diagnosed with anything specific, but it is believed he truly believed the delusions about Sophie letting Mark into the house and allowing him to inject people with heroin and sexually abuse Sabrina's children. The trial began in May 2018. Both Sam and Sabrina admitted to trying to dispose of Sophie's body but continued to blame each other for the actual murder. The evidence was overwhelming against them, especially the recordings of the torture. On May 24, 2018, after a 2-month trial, both Sabrina and Sam were found guilty of the murder of Sophie Lean. At sentencing, Sabrina wrote a letter addressed to Sophie and her family, which she read at the hearing in an attempt to gain leniency. The letter read, "I wish everyone, including Sophie, especially her parents and family who are suffering badly, to know how deeply sorry I am for what happened to Sophie. We shared many good times together as well as pains until things went terribly wrong and it ended up in this horrendous tragedy. I think of you every day and I'm shocked and sad that you are not a part of this world anymore. It feels like a horrible dream to me that I wish I could just wake up from. Every day I live with sadness and sorrow. I'm suffering every day thinking of you and what happened to you that dreadful night. I only wish I could turn back the clock so that it never happened and you would still be alive with us today. I will now live without hope and I can't ever imagine being happy again. I struggle every day and I'm disappointed in myself. Sophie, I wish things could have been different and I hope that you rest in peace with God. With deepest regret, Sabrina." The judge saw through Sabrina's manipulative letter and said, "You were both involved in torturing Sophie in the bath in the lead-up to her death, in making her think she would drown unless you gave her information you wanted, which was not in her power to give because it did not exist. The suffering and torture you put her through before her death was prolonged and without pity." The judge then sentenced both Sabrina and Sam to life imprisonment, to serve a minimum of 40 years. Sophie's body was returned to her family in France, where she was laid to rest. Her mother Catherine said, "No God will ever forgive you both for what you have done to my daughter. You were equally as evil as one another." Sophie's father Patrick said, "Nothing indicated that it was so serious. If it had, I would have gone to join her. I don't know if I can stand up to the shock or collapse. And it breaks my heart to know that she was abused to the end of her life." This case remains one of the most heartbreaking examples of how vulnerable young people seeking opportunity abroad can fall victim to those who would exploit and destroy them. Sophie Lean came to London with dreams of improving her English and working with children, something she had always wanted to do. Instead, she encountered two individuals whose shared delusions and capacity for cruelty that led to weeks of unimaginable torture and ultimately her death. Thank you for listening to this tragic story. Until next time, take care of yourselves.